Let's change the world together. Welcome to the Snapcast, the podcast for all nonprofit professionals, bringing you interviews and amazing ideas for nonprofit leaders.
Hello, and thank you for joining us today on the Nonprofit Snapcast. I'm very happy today to be speaking with David Somerfleck. David is the principal at DMS Blue. Is that correct, David?
You got it.
And Kate West from the Fundraising Lab. That's your entity, right, Kate?
Yep.
Excellent. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, a joint three-way conversation, which is kind of a rarity for this Nonprofit Snapcast. And this all started with a thread that the three of us read on Facebook, one of the many nonprofit groups on Facebook. A person had written something about the feasibility of moving nonprofit operations along using simply volunteer help. And the three of us, I think, had pretty strong reactions to the prospect of doing that. And that led to us having this conversation today. So thank you, both of you, for making the time to do this. I know this has been a long time in the planning, but I'm glad we get to finally get together and do this. Let me kick it off by using the title that David put out earlier. And the overall question is, I think, can nonprofits be bootstrapped for free? And the first talking point under that overall heading is what's the harm in trying to make a business plan that relies on nonprofit help instead of actual paid staff? And Kate, would you take it away and get us started on this?
Yeah, I have been a fundraising consultant and staff for 25 years, nonprofit world. And I think it's the exception rather than the rule that nonprofits that are bootstrapped, meaning self-funded, which means volunteer-led and volunteer staff, are just not scalable. They are not able to grow to the capacity that their community and their clients need them to meet their mission. So it's just not, it's not a sustainable model. I've seen in my experience. And it's either because you have a working board who contributes what they can, but they're working as board members, or you have a founder who's a staff person, like an executive director who is doing it for free, and the board then once they start doing that, the board continues to expect them to continue to do it for free as a volunteer or unpaid staff. Really, they're not volunteers, they're unpaid staff. And they have trouble shifting into a normal business model where staff earn salaries.
Right.
Yeah.
David?
Well, my background is basically I worked for different marketing and advertising agencies for well over 20 years. I stopped counting after 20 years. And in between those positions, I would work as a freelancer, applying the structures and methodologies that I had learned from agencies to my own private consulting. And of course, I'm older than 20 or 25, unfortunately. So I also started my own nonprofit for a brief period of time as a mediator. And it was a horrific nightmare. And that's with the experience and knowledge that I have. Getting audited every year and having extremely limited budget, if anything. And here I am with all of this experience. And of course, during all that time, I worked for nonprofits. And I also was a certified small business mentor for an organization called SCORE, which is a division of the United States Small Business Administration. So I was working with them off and on for almost 10 years. And after that point, I just decided, I think I know everything I could possibly learn from this. I'm very grateful for it. Let's move on. The idea that you can bootstrap a business with unpaid staff is simply not realistic. And an NPO, a nonprofit organization, at its heart, at the end of the day, is still a business and needs to be run as such. It's an extremely misunderstood concept that a nonprofit makes no money. It's ridiculous. They misunderstand what nonprofit means. It's a legal term.
Not a business plan.
Right. Kaiser Permanente is a nonprofit organization, and most cities have a gigantic Kaiser Permanente skyscraper in there somewhere. They're probably the most single profitable NPO on the planet. You invest back into infrastructure. That's the purpose of making money for an NPO. So if you're not doing that, then how's it going to make it? Now, according to Forbes, and I would also think just common sense, the vast majority of nonprofit organizations are going to go belly up within their first several years. In fact, let me see if I can find this link here very quickly here. The National Center on Charitable Statistics reveals that approximately 30% of nonprofits fail to exist after 10 years. But according to Forbes, over half of nonprofits that are chartered are destined to fail within just a few years due to leadership issues or lack of strategic planning. Okay, so this idea that you can get something for nothing, even if we totally exclude any kind of spirituality, even if we exclude any kind of ethics or morality, you can't get something for nothing. It's just simple cause and effect. Right. You can't take money out of an empty bank account, and you can't prime a pump that has no water at the bottom of the well. And that's what they're trying to do. And I think in some cases, obviously not all, I think part of the rationalization for that is that these individual founders are themselves not convinced of the legitimacy of what is in essence an idea that's unfounded. It hasn't gained any traction yet, so we don't know if it's going to make any money that we can reinvest. So let's just try to get everything we can for free and just see if that approach will work. And you can see how that approach works when you're running on a treadmill in almost every facet of life. You can see how this is working with COVID-19, whether you believe it's real or not. We've had it. Now they're trying to play catch up with the vaccine, and everybody's running on a treadmill trying to get caught up. It just doesn't work. Right. It's probably not the best analogy in the world, but you have staff who are working unpredictable schedules, who are primarily unmotivated, even if they're the most sweet, good-natured people in the world. That means they're going to have to do something else for money. And then they're largely inexperienced in the areas in which they're assigned because they're working for free. Right. I mean, I'm retired, thank God, knock on wood, but I'm not going to work for free for a nonprofit just out of principle, because they won't listen to anything I have to say. If that insight is being given for no cost, therefore it has no value.
Kate, you had said something early on. I'm sorry to interrupt you, David, but
sure.
You said that there's a couple of different reasons why nonprofits need to distinguish between volunteers and unpaid staff. And one of them is related to skill set. And the other one's related to reliability. Is that still accurate?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to, it's a nice dovetail on what David was just saying about, there's this thing that happens when people work for free in their own mind. They don't see it as a job. And most people do not take it as seriously. For example, they won't write a job description. There's not accountability because they say, I'm working for free. And a lot of times people in volunteer positions end up taking on jobs they have no experience doing. They have no skill set because they're working for free. And so you don't have the level of professionalism that's inherent in a salaried or even hourly position, where there's some sort of professional assumptions made about people because they're in a professional role. With my clients, I really push them to distinguish between the role of volunteers and the role of unpaid staff. And the reason it's important is because even if a nonprofit, and I work with a lot of startups and young nonprofits, and even if a nonprofit is bootstrapping in the first couple of years, I really encourage them to put a value on the unpaid staff's positions, write it into their budget so it has a value. And then in the income in the revenue section of their budget, balance it out with an in-kind donation of their time so that they can see, their donors can see, the board can see that there is a value to their time, and their unpaid time is a placeholder maybe for now, because the longer they go on without valuing their time, the more other people assume they'll do it forever.
Plus, it's, I think, totally valuable data to include in what may end up being an annual report.
Absolutely.
The value of the volunteer hour. Yeah.
Yes, because a value of a volunteer hour is set by a National Council of Volunteerism at 20 something. I don't know the exact number for 2020, but an unpaid professional service is what you decide it's worth. So it's two different things. Volunteers are unskilled.
Right.
Unpaid
That's certainly
staff
the perception.
yeah, it's two different designations. So that's really important for people to understand, I think.
Right. I think it's pretty rare to find a dedicated volunteer who actually treats their volunteer gig like a job.
Yeah.
But you're right. It's sort of this double-edged sword. On the one hand, the nonprofit may not value the thing that they're not paying for, and the volunteer may not value the thing that they're not getting paid for. I don't know if that's a clear way to say it, but David, what would you think? What do you think, David?
Well, I agree with Kate, but also I would add, if you flip it and look at it from a practical standpoint, because I remember when I was in college, you would have internships. Okay. And I remember going to nonprofits. And then when I was older, putting together a resume, and I remember someone at one of the marketing agencies told me, he said, well, if you worked for free, it's not really considered a professional position, is it? So, you may have gotten this experience, but it was unpaid. They didn't keep any records or any track of what you did or what your contributions were. If we call the NPO, will they remember you as a volunteer? It just isn't perceived in the same way as an actual paid position. And you certainly don't feel the same way about yourself. And, again, you're doing work that for a government agency, at the lowest rung on the ladder would be $30,000 if you're a receptionist, right? And now you're doing it for free. Well, what does that say about your perceived value? It's nothing. And the idea that, well, we can't pay you, that's just not true. Every NPO that's established has a senior staff who are extremely well paid. If you look at any established NPO, you look at their board of directors, you look at their senior staff members, they're all compensated appropriately as they should be. And yet then you have, non-paid volunteer staff members who are doing what is the equivalent of a professional position for nothing, in the hope that they're going to get some kind of credit for this or some experience on a resume, in which case they're inexperienced. Or on the other end of the spectrum, they're retired and just want some reason to get out of the house and to get about. In which case, they may or may not be doing something that's a good fit for them. I remember going to a museum once and looking for a tour guide, and they said, well, we don't have any tour guides. You're just going to have to wander around yourself. And I said, why is that? Because the tour guides are here on a volunteer basis. So the tour guide for today didn't show up. Okay, that's good. But if I were going to donate money to that NPO, that museum, I wouldn't do it, because, well, how are you running your outfit?
Right.
It's not realistic. It's not tenable. It's not sustainable.
Kate, you have said that in your experience, boards are a little reluctant to shift those bootstrapped positions, those volunteer filled positions, into paying roles. How do you get a nonprofit to move in that direction when they may be reluctant to do so?
I don't think you really get a nonprofit to move in a direction that they're reluctant to do so, unfortunately. The culture of a nonprofit can be pretty intractable. And typically it takes an outsider coming in. Typically it takes an outsider hired by the board. Outsiders hired by staff do not have influence with boards. I'm
interesting.
sorry to say. in my own experience, when the board kind of cracks, makes a little light, it's easier to step into that. And I think, but having said that, I will say that most nonprofit board members who come to their positions they're not professional nonprofit board members. And maybe they've had some education, but most of them are just, they fall into it and they learn by doing. And so they really are hungry for support and education. And you really can step in and say, no, this is not how things are done. You really do have an opportunity to step in and say how to help them learn how to improve not just what they're doing in their own role, but the culture and the longevity of the organization, so it can last, so that it can be sustained over time, which is what they want. They are committed to the longevity of the organization, and sometimes they just need their eyes open to a better way of doing that, or the best way of doing that.
I think it's interesting
the best practice.
Sure.
Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you made the distinction that it helps if the board hires that third party to come in. I was not aware that staff hired consultants didn't carry the same weight.
Oh, I've noticed it's a big difference. It's a big difference. And a skillful executive director can get the board to think it's their idea.
Excellent.
Mickey, can I just follow up on what David was saying about?
Oh, please. Yes, please.
Because he brought up the idea of internships. And this is one thing, as my background's in social work, and I've been in the nonprofit world my whole career. But this is something I feel strongly about in terms of unpaid staff, also from a social justice perspective, because the people who can work without pay are usually pretty well off people. If you don't need money, and what is the nonprofit world doing not paying people? I mean, what is that about? I mean, just from a political kind of,
right,
through a political lens. So I really do think that it's another perspective for nonprofit organizations, boards, and leadership to think about, do we really want to be in the business of having on our staff only middle class people who can afford not to work, for maybe one partner in a partnered relationship not to work? Is that what we really want to advance as our culture? Is that what we really want to get behind? And do we really want to get behind not paying people a livable wage? I mean, after it becomes a values question that nonprofits really have to examine when they look at their place in their community.
Right.
And from a funder's perspective, I know nonprofits tell themselves funders don't want to fund this and they don't want to fund that. Funders will fund what you present to them if you have a good argument for it.
That's exactly it. I agree 100%. This idea that you can grow a business with no money and no marketing and no content and no paid advertising is just, it's a concept that is born of either desperation or misinformation or lack of commitment. As I said earlier, larger nonprofits invest into infrastructure. And every large nonprofit organization that's successful has a marketing budget. They have paid staff, usually an army of paid staff. And whatever they delegate insofar as unpaid volunteer staff is minimal. I had someone ask me on some forum somewhere, how can I tell if something is appropriate for do it yourself or if I should try to do it for free? And I said, that's simple. If it doesn't matter to you, then try to do it yourself. If your mortgage, your rent, or the success and profitability of your NPO matters to you, then it matters enough to invest realistically. And insofar as marketing goes, most large established organizations such as Google and hosting companies offer scaled down rates anyway. So, I mean, they're more than happy to work with most nonprofits.
Yeah.
If the commitment is 50%, you can work with it.
There's something you said at the top of the episode, Kate, that I wanted to circle back to, which was the notion that volunteer-led organizations cannot grow or scale. And is that related to the other two things that are on our list? Is that related to the idea that you cannot really institutionalize volunteer-led organizations? Is it only the institutionalized organizations that can grow or scale? The other thing we've touched on, we'll come back to that in a second, but when volunteers inhabit formal roles in organizations, it tends to lead to a corner cutting behavior within the organization overall. But let's first go back to the notion that volunteer-led organizations cannot grow or scale. Can you explain some more about that and maybe give us an example? An example may be hard, so yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it's because in order to grow and scale, you need to keep adding staff. Mm-hmm. And if you're a volunteer completely run organization, you're going to need to add other volunteer staff. And when you think about who volunteers are, they're either people who work full time and they do it like in the corners of their lives where, or they're wealthy people who can work for free. And even people who are wealthy and work for free still will not treat it like a job. So scaling an organization requires paid staff. And I think a lot of people get into they have a passion. The world absolutely needs these people. Like that one message I do not want people to hear from this episode is that, the world does not need you. No, the world needs you. The world needs you. Believe me, The world needs you. But their intention is, I'm going to do this thing, and then people are going to be so jazzed about what I'm doing that I call it passion contagion. Mm-hmm. It's going to catch on, and I'm going to have all these people that are going to feel the same way I feel, with as much power as I feel it, and I'll have no problem convincing all these people to just join me in my mission. And yeah, maybe it's a bit naive, but they're so jazzed because their passion, which really is amazing. I mean, it really, really is amazing. If only we could channel all that passion, But unfortunately, what happens is the burnout is it's rampant.
Burnout is terrible. Yeah.
Yeah, burnout's really, really terrible.
I'm sorry, I was just going to say, in a lot of cases, that enthusiasm and unbridled passion, which is, like you said, wonderful. I agree. But the problem with that and the lack of infrastructures, what happens if that best case scenario comes true? What do you do then? What do you do if you're an NPO and you start getting 30 phone calls per day for services, but you don't have the infrastructure, you don't have the paid staff to return those phone calls or respond to those emails? Or what if you have 20 people asking you for that coupon or purchase something through your e-commerce store, but you have volunteers doing the shipping? Well, things are going to get lost. Things are going to be misplaced or mismanaged. Right. So you have to have a strong foundation, or you just can't proceed. And that just goes on back to what you were saying, Kate.
Yeah.
You have to run your nonprofit like a for-profit.
Yeah.
And that's what the successful, larger, competitive nonprofits have done.
And I think there's a huge myth in the nonprofit world that donors and funders do not want to fund salaries. And I don't know, anyone who runs a business knows that 80% of your budget is salaries. Yeah. I mean, anyone who's savvy, and foundations, I mean, I've spent most of my career as a grant writer. Foundations know that grant money goes to salaries and fringe benefits and paid vacation and health insurance and all the stuff that people need to run an organization professionally so it lasts forever. That's what we want. We want longevity, we want stability, we want predictability. And the way you get that is by paying staff. So there's no, funders I don't know where nonprofit people get that. Maybe it's in some fields, like people say, like in the animal welfare field, they're more reluctant to fund staff positions. I'm not sure about that, but every funder I've ever worked with understands the importance of salaried staff.
So we've been saying all along that volunteer-led organizations can't grow or scale. Volunteer-led organizations cannot be institutionalized. But I think that a big piece of that is also human capital. As long as you're looking at a population that doesn't have the same, I don't know what word to use. I was about to say loyalty, and that's not right. But you can't let the knowledge share of your organization be relegated to volunteers. What happens if one of them does go away? What if they're not legally beholden to the organization at that point? So you lose an entire function if that person, God forbid, gets called away from their job for whatever reason, their nonprofit job, their volunteer job for whatever reason. But
or the hit by a bus.
The hit by a bus.
And for that matter, they have very little motivation to really take intellectual property seriously. Why would you? You're not getting paid anything.
Right.
And, if anything, it would actually increase the feelings of disenfranchisement. Imagine from my perspective, you're working in marketing for an NPO and I write large amounts of marketing collateral for you. What is my motivation for not taking some of that or something, or not wanting to repurpose that? I'm not getting paid. Why would I do that? Why would I build a beautiful, modern, responsive website for an NPO for free, and I can't put my name on it? I can't claim copyright of it. I can't feature it in my portfolio, or or have some control over it at the very least. On and on. It on multiple levels. It's a flawed premise.
Yep. Hey, what is the God forbid you get hit by a bus one day mantra all about?
This is my mantra that I use with clients all the time to encourage them to institutionalize. For me, it's usually their fundraising, which means investing in a CRM and some sort of data management system for their donors. Investing in staff people, investing in the time that it takes to write policies and procedures, employee handbooks, donor policies. What do we do if we get a gift of stock? It can't just be in someone's head, because God forbid they get hit by a bus, and there goes the organization with the person. So when you're dealing with unpaid staff in these leadership type positions, they're not going to be devoting their time to writing policy. Maybe they don't even know how. I mean, it's a professional level skill to know how to write personnel policies. And you guys are on these Facebook groups with me every day. You see, does anyone have an example of and I'm just like, I mean, I wouldn't be giving my policies to somebody else, because it's not just intellectual property, but there's a legal aspect to it. That's another show. That's another show for another day. But there's a certain amount of professionalism that goes into building the infrastructure of an organization that's outside of service provision. Service provision is only one thing that nonprofits do, but there's this whole other infrastructure that has to be built inside an organization that unpaid staff are just not going to do.
Right. So we've been sitting here the entire time making I think a very solid case as to why a nonprofit should not bootstrap its operation with volunteers. It's there, you have issues of reliability, you have issues of knowledge share, you have issues of fiscal responsibility, inefficiency. And we've also touched on the notion that it's hard to get a nonprofit to change itself, to move away from the notion of using volunteer help from everything to actually installing paid staff as part of their business plan. Why
would you? It's like, what's that old saying? You trying to get the milk from the cow, or I forget how that old saying goes. But once you're addicted to getting something for nothing, whether it's effective or not, why would you pay for something if you perceive that you could get it for free? But the question is, are you getting anything of substantive value for this perception of free. Again, DIY, when do you know DIY is appropriate? If what you're doing doesn't matter to you, fine. But if what you're doing does matter to you, then you got to be willing to invest reasonably into it. There's no service provider who will give you qualitative results for free. It just simply doesn't exist. Or one day will give you credit. I mean, an adult is not going to accept that.
Right.
Just out of principle, if not logic. And to go on with what Kate was saying, I wanted to add, you can't have a CRM, which is customer relationship management tool, to track. You can't have that. Now, maybe you could have it for discounted rate, but it's extremely unusual to have one that's effective for free. Okay. Then if you want to have a CRM, don't you want to know what your SEO is? How are you competing against larger competitors who are eating your lunch? How are you competing? Well, with no search engine optimization, you can't compete in Google. And if you're working with someone who's a volunteer, they're not getting paid, odds are they're either a neighborhood hobbyist and woefully incompetent, or they're extremely new, in which case they don't know what they're doing, or they're an older retiree who probably is not an expert in SEO. Then you have PPC, which is pay per click advertising. If you want to put ads on LinkedIn, which is probably what you'd want to do, because that targets professionals. Then you have Facebook, which is over 2 billion users every day. So how are you going to get all of these things for free and get a professional to bring them all together? That's highly unlikely you're going to find someone who's going to do even a decent level job at that. Right. And they don't feel valued. They don't feel like you take it seriously. It's not the same thing as answering phones.
Right. So it seems like the gist of what we're all saying is, in order to really do the thing professionally, and by the thing, I mean, serve people, via some nonprofit mechanism, in order to do that effectively, and in order to avoid all these dangers and pitfalls that we've been talking about for the last half hour or so, the best way to go about doing that is to plan from the start, to not rely on volunteer help to fill critical roles within the organization. Is that not fair? Is that not a fair thing to say to the nonprofit world?
I think it's fair advice. I don't know how realistic it is in the nonprofit world, but I do think it's fair advice. And I think that it's good advice. And I hope that people who are listening, who are thinking about starting nonprofits, maybe will just take a beat and think, what do I need? What kind of plan do I need outside of the services? What kind of organizational or business plan do I need to think about, to make sure that in 5 years, in 10 years, my organization is still around?
David?
You can't get from point A to point B, whatever point B is, without spending something figuratively and monetarily. And one of my favorite quotes is a quote from Henry David Thoreau, who wrote Walden. And I like it very much. And he said, build your castles in the air, for that is where they belong. Now lay your foundation beneath it. It's wonderful to have lofty goals and ambitions. Well, we've all heard that saying that the road to hell is paved with good intention. You're just not going to be able to get sustainable traction and be able to scale for any kind of growth, thinking that you're going to have trustworthy, enthusiastic, competent, and dependable staff, much less the infrastructure, like what I was saying with the SEO and the PPC and the website design and the backup and the training and all of that, without investing at least something that's realistic. If you can afford to put an ad in a local newspaper, you can afford to set aside that same amount for just about anything of quality. And it really is a very, very easy way to estimate budgets when I talk to NPOs.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I'm sure that we could continue to talk an entire hour or more about this topic of business planning in general for nonprofits. But I want to wrap the episode here and give Kate the parting shot. Kate, do you have anything you want to say in summary for our audience today?
If you have a passion for a mission, the world needs you, absolutely needs you. Your community needs you. But starting a nonprofit might not be the best use of your passion. So think about strategically how you want to build, how you want to solve your community's problems, and how you want to be a part of that.
David, anything to follow along with that?
I agree wholeheartedly with Kate. I would just add that, remember, nonprofit doesn't mean no profit. It means invest profits back into infrastructure. Infrastructure is marketing, it's promoting, it's building your business.
Fantastic.
Perfect.
Kate, David, thank you. Kate, if a listener wanted to be in touch with you and learn more about your consulting work, where would they find you?
They can find me at yourfundraisinglab.com. I teach fundraising courses and I provide fundraising services for nonprofits.
And anywhere in the country, or are you local to a specific area?
I'm international.
Right on. Very cool. And David, I know you're a veteran to the Nonprofit Snapcast, but how do people find you?
www.dms.blue. You can also go to Google and type in dms.blue and find me that way as well.
Got it. Thank you. I really appreciate you two taking the time to do this with me today, joining me in this experiment for a first three-way discussion on the Snapcast. And I hope we can do more of this again in the future. So, but thanks, you guys. This has been good.
Thank you, Mickey.
Okay.
Thank you, Kate.
Thank you, Mickey.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, Kate. Nice talking to you.
To our listeners, thank you for joining us for this episode. We invite you to be a part of these conversations. If you have an idea for the program or would like to be a guest on a future episode, please drop us a line via our website, nonprofitsnapcast.org. In the meantime, we'll see you with another episode in a few days.
This has been the Snapcast. Thank you for joining us.